Quisiera empezar por presentar a la doctora Mary Jane Myers, que es profesora de la Universidad de Queens en Canadá. Voy a leer su currículum y vamos a proceder a su presentación. La doctora Mary Jane Myers tiene un doctorado de la Universidad de Estrasburgo, en Francia. Su doctorado es en Psicología del Lenguaje y Comunicación. Tiene asimismo una especialización en Lingüística y Lingüística Aplicada. Ella, su área de especialización ha sido pero muy enfocada a la cuestión de educación. Tanto para su maestría como su doctorado, ella investigó sobre soportes visuales para el aprendizaje de lenguas y realizó estudios experimentales sobre cómo la gente lee el significado de las imágenes, así como la manera de dirigir la decodificación y cómo modificar la imagen para incrementar las conexiones entre la imagen y el significado que expresa el decodificador. La doctora Myers es profesora de tiempo completo en la Universidad de Queens en Canadá y estuvo previamente en la Universidad Dalhousie, ¿is that the correct pronunciation? Dalhousie. Ella vino a Canadá mediante una beca del Canada Research Council Fellowship para estudiar en la Universidad de Ottawa. Su enseñanza e investigación es en las áreas de aprendizaje, enseñanza y comunicación del lenguaje, la gramática de las imágenes y la cognición visual, lenguaje para propósitos especiales, comunicación intercultural, semiótica y pragmática. Ella participa en los programas de licenciatura y posgrados de la Facultad de Educación y también asesora a estudiantes en los niveles de maestría y doctorado. Sus proyectos de investigación más importantes incluyen, dentro de una red de investigación estratégica de 5 años, un proyecto sobre la evaluación de tecnologías de aprendizaje de un segundo lenguaje para el desarrollo de la alfabetización. Recientemente, ella completó un estudio financiado por el Ministerio de Educación de Ontario sobre recién llegados a las escuelas canadienses. Actualmente realiza investigación sobre la sensibilidad intercultural, sobre conocimiento en acción y sobre representaciones visuales. Ha sido una académica invitada a la Universidad de Malaya, la Universidad de Macquarie y las universidades de Ho Chi Minh, Antwerp, Roma y Hong Kong, entre otras. Me estaba comentando que actualmente la doctora ha sido invitada para una conferencia en Azerbaiyán, para próximamente. Tiene más de 100 artículos arbitrados y ha presentado textos en conferencias locales, nacionales e internacionales. Su trabajo ha sido publicado en revistas académicas como Call, Recall, la revista francesa de lingüística y aplicada, Educación Comparada, la revista canadiense de lenguaje moderno y publicaciones de Elsevier y Springer. Sus libros recientes incluyen Modalidades de aprendizaje de una segunda lengua, en 2004, colección de campos lingüísticos de la Universidad de Beck, Aspectos innovadores en inserción escolar francófona, en 2014, Ediciones universitarias europeas, y Las novedades en las escuelas, cómo lidiar con situaciones cada vez más complejas, en 2014. Bien, esta sería el currículum de la doctora. Vamos a proceder, creo que no todos son muy fluidos en inglés, entonces vamos a trabajar con una traducción. Si por ahí me atoro, por favor, les pido que me echen la mano.
Thank you, Miguel. So now, after this presentation, you have higher expectations of me, right? I'll try my best. Before I'm going to start my official presentation, I'm going to do what I usually try to do, which is connect to the local people. And so I tried to see in Mexico City, since I arrived for the last 2 days, to see if my theoretical presentation can correspond to an example I find in this local society. And I did find something fascinating.
Can you stop so I can?
Pardon?
Can you stop?
Oh,
I can.
just say that.
Entendieron más o menos. ¿Sí? Okay.
Okay.
¿No? Okay.
So anyway, I found an ad for Missa Solemne by Beethoven, And it shows some of the theories that I'm going to talk about, or that I found from visual cognition, where there's displacement. And today in the world, there are lots of offsetting tendencies. And this is a beautiful example. I don't know if you can all see it. I just found that yesterday because I was searching for things. And you see, you have Beethoven on a very classical gray background, but his eyes were cut out, moved sideways. Yeah, in a second when I'm finished. And that's typical as an attempt to have the person talk to you. If you just had Beethoven's portrait, you'd just say, okay, static, old traditional portrait. Here, the eyes are removed, talking to you. Then they moved his hand towards the direction of the instructions when the concert will be held. Okay? And the other interesting thing, which is totally within today's visual cognition theory, it talks about the mind's eye, where they show how he's writing. He was writing his symphonies above his head. There's a hand with a script. Okay, so I was really, bravo. I think you're doing wonderful things here, because whoever did this shows that you know the latest, the most advanced in terms of techniques and design and everything. Okay.
If I can explain.
Yes. Okay.
Sí, la doctora quería cerciorarse de que el tema que va a presentar el día de hoy, que es la cognición visual, ella está muy enfocada al estudio de la percepción, pero desde un punto de vista muy científico. Y trataba de ubicar lo que ella iba a dar el día de hoy en el contexto de la Ciudad de México. Entonces vio este ejemplo sobre Beethoven, en el cual lo que ella dice es que para comunicar algo, pues normalmente la gente utilizaría un retrato y tal vez de Beethoven, y tal vez no haría algo más. Pero aquí ya ella vio un manejo muy específico, por ejemplo, la mirada y cómo se señalaba la información, y ella trataba de ligar eso a cómo el cerebro procesa esa información y desde luego integrarlo a la presentación de hoy. Y se dio cuenta que pues, es un trabajo con una intencionalidad, y por lo tanto hay gente que maneja esas estrategias, aunque tal vez no conocen, y creo que es el caso de nosotros, no conocemos muchas veces las razones por las cuales el cerebro procesa de cierta manera la información.
Okay, so you've seen my title, so I'm not going to repeat it. So.
Okay. Aquí está, vieron el título de la presentación,
okay.
Y lo que hicimos es poner la traducción también en español, de tal manera que ustedes puedan ir siguiendo la presentación de la doctora.
Okay.
But anyway, please allow me some minutes, some
time
to
yes.
translate.
So as an introduction, I'm saying that commercial art is fast developing, and it already adds incredible value to everything in which it is involved. But there are lots of challenges. There are new techniques, new technologies to be used. You have to think about global appeal versus looking at specific publics. And most importantly, whatever is emotional, the visual pleasure and the emotional and intellectual vitality of the experience, regardless of the area you are involved in, those are becoming increasingly important. And more so in cognition, the importance lies upon increasing memory storage, because you want to have an impact, and you don't just want it to be fleeting. You want the image to stick in your head. So this is very important, and I think that's why this example I thought was beautiful. And in today's society, I think whatever research you're doing in your fields, you have to think of creating varied and faster ways to have an impact. That's how you're going to get to the leading edge. That's how you're going to be more successful. And I will also give you more examples of the latest research in terms of cognitive studies. So I would like to see the picture, the first one, and the next. Okay, so the picture on the left is corresponding to complexity. So we have complexity theory, of course, if you're probably familiar with it. And many of the views are kaleidoscopic, where you see lots of things. And it, if you look at this, it comes from injection by Supakic on music performance, the picture on the left. It's entitled Bounce Baby Bounce, and it's found in Bello, a Spanish magazine. And what is interesting is you can see records in the background moving, so the old style of records, but then you have all those other pictures coming into your mind. And what is really typical of this, there was a lot of inscribed information as well. You also see there's not much use of white. In the past, there was a lot of use of white. Now, there's a reversal. More color, filling everything, less white. What I think is also important here, and I'm going to connect this to visual cognition, the latest research has shown that when we look at things, the important part is the fovea, which is the central retinal area. And apparently, we only see that. Whatever is around, but there are some other theories I will talk about later. Whatever is around is not being processed in the same way. Okay, so I picked that first example because it almost looks like the artist tried to trick you to look at the whole page with your fovea. So you have a big impact, okay? And you cannot say, oh, this is really where my focus is. The focus is a whole area. So I thought that was an interesting idea.
Excuse me.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Si gustan, no quisiera yo tampoco interrumpir la presentación, pero si alguien tiene dudas podemos hacer un breve comentario en español o preferirían todo en inglés para no cortar la continuidad. Bueno, sí quisiera nada más remarcar algunas cosas. La doctora hablaba de el manejo de la memoria, del procesamiento de la memoria. Entonces, desde el punto de vista cognitivo, ese es un aspecto muy importante. ¿Qué cantidad de información se procesa? ¿Sí? Y entonces, lo está ejemplificando en este cartel que se aparece en una revista española, en la cual lo que ella dice es que en el ojo hay un área atrás del ojo que es la fovea, y que la imagen se representa en esa parte del ojo, ¿sí? Y en este caso el artista lo que hace es, normalmente la información o la imagen se presenta en detalles para pasar el mensaje. En este caso, lo que hace el artista es que crea una imagen que está con muchos elementos y esos elementos se ven como un todo, ¿sí? Que es obvio, pero aquí lo interesante es ver cómo desde la mente, cómo estamos procesando esa información.
So I will show you several pictures, and each time I will add the theoretical background. Then after my introduction, I will go to review Gestalt psychology in today's world. Then I'm going to talk about communication, then about the viewer, and finally I will show how to disrespect the rules with examples, and a quick conclusion to the future of design. Now, if I can't finish it all, Miguel said you're going to have a publication, but I will try my best. Okay, so what I have to...
Can I say that? Bueno, la presentación de hoy va a consistir básicamente, ahorita va a presentar otros ejemplos y luego va a trabajar un poquito más teóricamente. Va a hablar sobre las nuevas teorías de la Gestalt, que creo que esa parte nos interesa mucho, el perceptor, y bueno, va a presentar varias partes y con la idea de que al final esto se va a publicar. Entonces, si alguien tiene interés en conocer más sobre esto, va a poder acceder a la información en el artículo.
Okay. So as you know, there's a need for more specialization, more definition, and there's a greater need for graphic design today. And I see a lot of new opportunities. So with the new technologies and the new studies on the mind, I think there might be some recipes I will give you that might help with economy in terms of your professions. At least I hope so, but at least it will also help you to articulate things maybe differently. I hope to bring in some new ideas, but you're all specialized, so I hope I can make some comments that would be useful for everybody. I think today, though, you need to be more aggressive because you have to understand the needs in marketing. And you have to even go beyond. You have to create a need. Like, for example, you have to ask how to stimulate or prompt or renew consumer attention. Like, you have to be the active part.
Bueno, en la última parte de la presentación ella va a presentar ejemplos y lo que quiere es que ustedes como especialistas puedan utilizarlo con una intención. Entonces, lo que plantea de entrada es que hoy en día los diseñadores y artistas gráficos debemos ser más agresivos, entre comillas, en la manera de presentar la información para llamar la atención, o a veces no solo llamarla, sino crear la atención, ¿no?
Maybe to go faster, I will not give the references, but the references will be in the text. So the second picture with the drinks, they come from a newspaper from France in June, and one is one on page, Desperados Freeze, first page, Granité, that's it. And then on the second page, you have a more specialized coinage with the beer added to it, and more specifics given about the company. So this again, if somebody didn't pay too much attention when the ad appeared first, flipping the page, seeing it on the second one, psychologically brings reinforcement. Okay? Can I go back to the introduction?
Sí. Please? Sí. Bueno, estos son anuncios de un periódico español, y entonces la idea es que la segunda imagen da un refuerzo al mensaje. ¿Podemos pasar al anterior, por favor?
So, I wanted to also point out the explicit and implicit sides of reality to be conveyed. For instance, I saw an ad, just the name of a company, Tutankhamon, sign for a truck specialist in France. They used the name Tutankhamon to try to stick it to memory. And then I have to go back to another picture.
Okay, podemos pasar a la siguiente.
The third one.
La tercera.
Okay. Also, what I think you need to do is add new concepts, different styles, using white and transparencies. And you're responsible for visual pleasure, but also for the emotional and intellectual vitality of the experience that is brought to the public. So here, that's again taken from a French newspaper for a women's race, to express girl power, just quickly, because I won't have time if I stop too long. It shows freshness with the greenery, and it shows also the energy and the Eiffel Tower very stylistically in the background. I'm going to stop.
Esa es para una carrera y representa a una mujer y bueno, los colores que muestran frescura. La doctora hablaba hace un rato sobre los fondos y hablaba de fondos oscuros, por ejemplo, el manejo actual de fondos oscuros o en este caso fondos un poco más vivos con transparencias.
So there's another figure, the next picture, please.
La siguiente, por favor.
Okay. This is taken again from Bello, the Spanish graphic arts magazine. Tourist, you are the terrorist. It's a totally different concept, and it shows the high impact the graphic artist is trying to have. And Willy Kunst, in 1998, talked about macro and micro aesthetics having to come into play today. And there also appears to be fast evolving diverse groups of people. So some of the previous images might have appealed to a certain population. This one, again, will be registered into the minds of other types of groups of people. So it's interesting to see how graphic artists are trying to provide utmost effectiveness, diversify, and multiply.
Bueno, en este caso, por ejemplo, ella presenta este ejemplo en el cual la frase es los turistas, you are terrorists, son terroristas, ¿sí? Entonces es como un planteamiento muy fuerte que juega un poco con las palabras, ¿no? Estas son diseñadas por Willy Kunst, no estoy seguro si es alemán u holandés, es un cartelista muy reconocido, y cómo cada mensaje, esto ya lo sabemos los diseñadores, va dirigido a cierto tipo de público, pero que pensemos que cuando ese tipo de público percibe el mensaje, también cómo lo está procesando, ¿no? Entonces, obviamente, un cartel con este mensaje tan fuerte está dirigido a un público muy específico, ¿no?
Okay, next picture, please.
La siguiente, por favor.
Okay, so there's another idea where there's a continuing advertisement on two different pages. And in visual cognition, they recognize the difference in intake when you look at a photograph versus the graphic aspect. And some people might look more at the photograph, some at the graphics. So this idea was very smart, I think, because there's a continuation on the same page. And when you look at that's for an advertisement for a party, a big party somewhere. So when you look at the confetti, only over the head are there the traditional confetti. However, the confetti now are triangular in shape, which is not the usual one. Then you have the graphics on the left, and you see there's a sweep, the confetti going off, continuing. So that's another thing for eye movement.
Este es un anuncio para una fiesta y aquí es interesante cómo se combinan, por un lado la fotografía y por el otro lado los gráficos, que normalmente uno tiende a ver una cosa o la otra, y aquí la idea es que al combinarlos aseguramos que se puedan percibir de una manera más fuerte o más intensa la imagen, y cómo está organizada la imagen con el confeti que tiene ciertas figuras, y las que están en las manos de la modelo, que son en forma triangular y como si estuviera soplándolas, y además es un anuncio que abarca 2 páginas.
Next picture, please.
La siguiente, por favor.
Okay, so anyway, semiotic studies are very important. You probably all have studied semiotics. If not, I recommend you follow this a little bit, because when you use semiotics, you can see that this ad has been very well conceptualized Okay, now it's traditional, the color red. Okay, but you have a big splash of red. The background is not white, it's all red. And they're using, again, it's a car advertisement for Renault, as you can see. You have the driver sitting in a comfortable shoe. And it's playing on the words, the French, voiture à votre pied, which is, in English, if the shoe fits, okay? So it's based on popular sayings or proverbs, and I think you have to use those a lot. Well, you probably do, because they appeal to people's emotions very deeply, and there was the familiarity attached to it.
Ok, este anuncio es para Renault y ella dice que es importante utilizar la semiótica. En este caso, pues la mayoría de nosotros estamos familiarizados con esto. Y en este caso la idea es basarse en frases en francés que la gente utiliza comúnmente, que es, y dar la idea de comodidad, ¿no? Entonces un carro en el cual cabes como cabe tu pie en un zapato.
Okay, and you're already familiar with perfume samples in magazines, where you usually put a little sample to smell. I don't think they do it very much today. But I think you have to think in the same terms. You have to add different surfaces, shiny or not shiny, etc., and different textures. I think that's very important because according also to visual perception…
You're talking about this one?
I'm continuing in my talk.
Okay.
And so what's important is to create a new experience, a new way of thinking, and like creating a big splash. We can continue the other pictures.
Okay. Podemos continuar con la otra. La doctora habla de que hay anuncios en los cuales, por ejemplo, en el caso de los perfumes, se agregan muestras para que uno pueda olerlos. También se juega con los materiales, papeles brillantes, en fin. Y lo importante es crear nuevas experiencias en el perceptor.
So, I also found a journal of the French National Graphic Arts School. There are those pictures here. So they're using, from visual cognition, they're using a lot of the techniques. And you can see it's shocking, or it could be, anyway, that's fine. I just think there's a bombardment of color, and also you'll have the references if you want to contact some of the people there. It shows non-conformity. There's a sense of humor. There's a donkey on picture 1 there. You see a donkey.
La imagen primera es un burro.
And this is a leitmotif through most of the pages, except the page which has a giraffe. So using different graphics, etc. And the second picture with the giraffe, that corresponds also to some principles. You see what? Okay. In visual cognition, and I'm going to refer to this research later, some researchers like Biederman, for example, have shown that you need 2 features or 3 features to identify an object. So that's an economy for the graphic artist. And the other important thing is it makes the brain work. And when there is effort, you remember things better. So in this case, okay.
This one is important. En el caso de la cognición visual, se ha hecho investigación en la cual para que algo se perciba mejor, es importante, cita Biederman, que un objeto o una imagen pueda tener por lo menos 2 o 3 características muy reconocibles, porque eso facilita el procesamiento de esa imagen.
Okay, and the other thing with the giraffe, basically, there's not much that shows you giraffe, okay? So they play with the surface, right? Yellow with dots, that's a giraffe. They put a tongue there. And then the other thing is the contrast between the historical, ancient and modern, okay, representing old art and the model.
Bueno, no les había comentado mucho, pero en la primera imagen representa un burro y en la segunda es la jirafa, pero la jirafa está muy camuflada, digamos, porque la representación es el amarillo y los puntos negros. Y entonces la idea es, en vez de hacerlo tan obvio, tan evidente, es camuflarlo allí. Y entonces está presente, pero hay otro tipo de elementos como objetos más antiguos.
Okay, can we continue, please?
Yes, sure.
Yes. Okay, so this was my introduction. I have a lot more. So what I suggest is maybe I go through the theoretical aspects without developing them too much, because then I have more pictures which show the theory applied. And maybe that would be more interesting to you, because you're going to have the write-up for the theoretical parts. So when I did my master's and my doctorate, it was on the grammar of pictures, okay? And I studied a lot Gestalt psychology and the newest development. So I did a master's on visual perception and cognition, and my doctorate as well. But things have moved a lot since then. So the old theory that has recently been subject to revival by graphic designers, pushing its limits in the following ways. Similarity versus something totally dissimilar, okay, anomalies. I already showed some examples. Continuation was a principle. I use this principle to push far and then add a surprise or an incongruity to shock. Closure, leave the items separated to the utmost so that an effort is required to put the whole piece together. Use different media. Okay, some of the examples I've shown actually appeal to that. Proximity, place the items just far enough to have people make the effort to place the shapes together. Because from visual cognition, researchers show that young people seem to look, but the mind isn't active. So to have an impact, you have to get the mind activated. Continue.
Sí.
It's translated, so we can just move.
Yes, but I would like to contextualize a little bit. Sorry. Nada más presentar las teorías de la Gestalt, porque la doctora hizo sus estudios de posgrado en esas áreas de percepción visual, y están mostrando esos principios, pero como desde una nueva visión de la Gestalt pueden cambiar un poquito.
Okay, next. So the researchers are looking at the perception of transparency, and if you look at new ads and visuals, transparency is used a lot. I don't know if you come across it, but it's quite interesting. They look at subjective contours, at modes of color appearance, and phenomenal transparency. You're all specialists in the field, so I'm sure you've come across that. And look at causality. Instead of direct presentation of spatio-temporal events, make use of modal and amodal completions. Okay, it goes a bit with Derrida's thinking, okay, of difference, right? So think of using those in graphic. I'm sure, actually, I have to say that I should apologize, because in my life, I was always convinced that artists and graphic artists were ahead of other researchers. But I tried to connect it with the actual research in cognition. So then they talk about the importance of contour integration and completion. And they look at more complexity. And an example of modern ways of doing it is using camouflage to have an object stand out. Or some people use regular patterns, but in the middle, they have just 3 odd ones, or things like that. And then you know about the golden spiral and intelligent design. And of course, all these traditional rules are being questioned, and new things are added to them. I will not have time if we don't continue.
Yes,
So
okay.
Can we just continue, please?
Yes.
So in terms of Gestalt, Palmer has worked on the new revival of Gestalt, and he says to look for common stimulus in color, in orientation, in size, and use how the visual system connects with brightness, color texture, motion, or the impression of motion, and depth. Wegeman's, you probably know these researchers, he recommends to explore generalized common fate, so generalized, objectives, whatever, brightness, grouping through change of values, like position, sunlight, shadows in your organization of visuals. Synchrony by grouping elements showing slight changes or change in positioning across your product. Put something odd that draws attention and interferes with the flow. By breaking expected strong temporal regularity. He recommends grouping by proximity or similarity. He recommends ways to look for equilibrium. And he recommends discrete dynamic patterns. Actually, a lot of artists now are using discrete dynamic patterns. Continue, please. New aspects, still tied to Gestalt. Recent research shows that connectedness with a line or something similar tries to help connect for decoding. Like, there in visual cognition, they talk about visual noise. That means it interferes. So for people who have trouble visually, because we are not all good at seeing things visually, to avoid people missing a connection, you should put some way of directing things, putting things together. Biederman, in his theory of human object recognition, suggested that although interpretation depends on overall configuration, it is important to know that the visual field allows illusory contours and figure ground segmentation through autonomous processes that are also context sensitive. Now, here I'm going to jump because I don't know how much I have, but it looks like it's going fast. One of the latest research results in visual cognition actually thinks that with there are two activities going on, and maybe you already know that, when we actually look at things, that the fovea is looking, actually we don't look at the detail first. We look at the overall thing first. And the mind's eye, they think, is actually looking ahead, okay, exploring things differently. And this is very possible because a lot of the research on reading, if you're familiar with how we read text, our eyes actually move ahead, okay? And there's just one element of our vision that concentrates on the words we're actually reading. The rest of our mind has already moved ahead. Okay, so that's the latest research in cognition. We continue? Okay. Oh, you want to translate this quickly?
Sí, rápidamente. Bueno, en este caso, de la última, lo más reciente en cuanto a investigación, dice que cuando el ojo está percibiendo a través de la fovea, lo que hace es que si estamos viendo diferentes detalles o diferentes formas, el ojo percibe la totalidad y lo que sucede es que la información se procesa en el cerebro y ahí es donde se identifican esos detalles o esas letras, o, en fin.
Okay, so the conclusion for Gestalt. I'm not rejecting Gestalt. I think the new research is worth investigating, but I think what specialists could do is create an online repository. I know you already have dictionaries, but this field is evolving so rapidly that maybe an online repository, like a Wikipedia type of thing, are just for graphic artists where you update things, okay? And you can grade innovation on a continuum as regards to what worked in certain situations, like semantic analysis. And also you can have examples of what worked, explaining the problems, and maybe invite more exploration and research. Actually, if your university sets up a website, you might ask for user fees and make some money to have other people access what you're doing. Okay.
So the repository is a suggestion.
Yeah, it's a suggestion. It's written there.
Sí, yeah. Bueno, una de las sugerencias que la doctora hace en cuanto a investigación es que tal vez algo que sería interesante poder hacer es un repositorio de estrategias y de imágenes, más que a veces publicar, sino como una especie de Wikipedia en la cual pudiera ver esas imágenes y la gente pudiera tener acceso a esa información.
Now my next chapter on communication, please. And I'm sorry, I'm going to go fast because I don't know if the time limit is what it says on the paper.
We have some latitude.
Okay, so it's all translated because I think translation takes a little bit of time.
Yes.
So I'm just going to move through this really quickly. Today we have problems of visual fatigue, and rather than using traditional rules, the designer creates the constraints to make people do what he or she wants them to do. You often work because you have an assignment, right? And you have to try to create something. New technology requires additional skill training and ongoing testing of the impact of all the new things. Okay, so I have an example with a basic mind, and that's again from cognition. If I say, don't imagine a small package wrapped in shiny white paper and tied with a red ribbon and a red bow. If I say don't imagine, can you avoid having it in your head? No. Okay? So sometimes the verbal added is useful. And then the other aspect I wanted to just point to. Every person here will have a different representation of this little package. Often my students ask them to draw it. And then what color red will you use? The red that this gentleman is wearing, the red, orangey red, red for my scarf, okay? That's a cultural issue too, as well as maybe a personal preference, okay? So all those things have an impact. So points to consider, what to represent, who will interact in the production, producers, who are the testers, should be tested before finalized, your product. I assume you test a product before it's finalized. The problem, small numbers. When you test it, you test with small numbers, but there might be huge numbers consuming, so your small number sample may not be accurate. 3, what are the people decoding the messages? What are the interactions between 1 and 2? What are the attitudes towards 1? What are the interactions among the people in 3? Like the people who are looking at it in a group, what are they going to react to? Okay, can you continue, please? Next, okay. The problems of gaps, disjunctions, because they are possible between the context of production and reception, and the graphics and the image in a product. Like if you work on image and graphics, there's a problem of a possible gap. Articulation and understanding in communicative resources used for the design. The knowledge of specific social contexts and encoding of interactions and social relations in that context. Connections between the graphics used. It requires competence and implies a structuring of that competence in the product, not just the skill getting. You may learn how to do it, but skill using, to actually use it in the product, requires an additional level of analyzing. Continue, please. So when you look at visuals, pictures and graphics, there are different types. You probably know that. Demand picture, where a picture addresses a public and asks the public for something. typical is when the army wants volunteers. They have somebody stare at you and get a finger to get you involved. Or offer pictures, like you offer something to buy. It's a different type of approach to the visual and to the graphics. What does distance do? What is the angle? What is the symbolic power difference? Do you want me to give you examples, or can I just skip those and you read them?
I think we are short.
Yeah. So let's continue.
Yes.
Thank you. So the viewer. So you have the producer and you have the viewer. The producers are more fluent. They're the specialists. They're active and they're eloquent. Usually, graphic art, design, I find very nice. They know their trade. But the viewer can accept a product or not. Remain passive? Well, hopefully, but they can. In today's world, they might. Although there might even be an effort of interpretation. The product has to somehow correspond to viewers' expected conventions being used. The viewer has to be educated too. Viewers' values and the beliefs of the social institutions, now even the global village. And this aspect apparently was used in religious figurines that you see in churches, the statues at compassion, to try to get you to react in a positive way. Okay, continue. Specific viewers, sometimes, when you do graphic art for specific viewers, and you exclude others. And if your impact on the viewer has to be global, you have to aim for the largest possible public. And then you have viewers in educational contexts. That's different, they're more demanding. So the viewer will also look differently at a photograph versus a drawing on a page. There might be a direct connotation with a photo seeing eye to eye, with a different vector. For instance, a finger pointing at the viewer. The viewer will tend to think the represented wants to get into an imaginary relation with him or her, if you want to convey that message. Yes, please, next. Recommendations. Now, again, from communication, there are a number of recommendations. And these are what I think are the latest. And I think if you don't have Timothy Samara's book, I have a French version, which probably might be more interesting to speakers of Spanish, but there is an English version. And he has written Manual of Graphic Design. And he has looked at David Jury's rules. Are you familiar with David Jury's rules of 1996? No. So I listed David Jury's rules, and then I'm going to talk about how Samara is trying to break the rules. Now there are 20 rules, and I provide about 15 pictures. Do we have time for that?
Very short.
Barely. Okay, so I'm not. So I'm not going to repeat David Jury's rules. Okay? So David Jury's rules of 1996 were used a lot by graphic designers. Now, Samara pushes beyond those rules. Okay, so I want picture number 1. Here we go. So picture number 1. Oh yeah, I have to read David Jury's rule. Without concepts, only emptiness.
Sin
Okay.
concepto, solo vacío.
Okay, but Samara says, having no concept is just a valid idea, is just as valid an idea than any other is. Okay? So here there's just graphs, no concepts. Image 2 is the one next to it. To communicate is to simplify. Image 2 is the one on the top. It's not simplified. He has a lot of impact in this image too. He says there's nothing wrong with embellishments, according to the author. You can take ideas from Baroque or Victorian art, and you can use a kaleidoscopic approach. So image 2 is the one on the right at the top. Okay? Not necessarily simplified. Image 3 at the bottom. Reach universalism. Samara says that you also have to reach subculture. if these are your audience. So see how he writes this for his subculture. Okay, next picture, please.
Las imágenes.
Pictures. Okay, we
I think
didn't enter them.
could be
Go back
important
up
read.
to
Yes,
the
yes,
text.
Yes. So
Okay. Okay, so no visual cacophony, less is more. 6, the use of white space is important, but okay, I have to go back to less is more. It's not true. Samara says complex representation today will attract your public. 6, the use of white space is important. According to Samara, it is right in general, but you should stop. You shouldn't stop to really invade your audience richly. Invade the space in some area. Rule number 7, without hierarchy, no direction is given. But Samara says, however, if the viewer has to sort out what is given because of the effort involved, things will better stick in memory. 8, symmetry is your good friend, says Jury. But Samara says, this is traditional. It can be used well with more dynamic features and help give impressions of elegance, cheerfulness, and restraint. 9, use depth and more depth. Samara agrees with Jury on this one, but he says that caution is important, as you don't want to take the visual reader away from the message. However, he feels that optically flat representations can also support an aggressive presentation, as long as there is alignment with the message. 10, color, but only with balance. According to Samara, breaking this code can bring about very effective results. Convention can in fact be boring. If not sticking with the color rule, you can in fact help and ease putting the message across. 11, Jury says less color is better. Samara says this is possibly so, but a viewer might better remember something if the array of colors was surprising or shocking. 12, use stronger positions of light and darkness, says Jury. Samara says softer contrasts can convey a feeling of elegance and meditation rather than aggression and tension. 13.
Excuse me, can I make a commentary?
Yes.
Nada más rápidamente interrumpo. Lo que pasa es que estas son una serie de reglas que se usan tradicionalmente para el diseño, del manejo de colores, espacios y demás. Y estas son propuestas de este autor Samaras, en las cuales es todo lo contrario, ¿no? Romper esas reglas.
Okay, can we see some of the pictures?
Podemos ver las imágenes. Ahora sí.
Okay, so you have number 4. Number 4 was no visual cacophony, but you see here he uses cacophony. Number 5, less is more. It's not true, he puts a lot on number 5. Number 6, white space. Well, he feels number 6 is a central picture. You can see that he fills it with a lot of things. Number 7, without hierarchy, no direction. You see how much text there is, okay? And when you look at it, it's quite informative. So there is no real hierarchy, and you can still make it informative. Number 8, symmetry is your good friend. Well, here Samara shows in number 8 that it's not the traditional way of using symmetry. It's quite shocking, or it's very different, a different use of symmetry. Okay, can we continue?
Okay.
Next. Okay, so number 9 was use depth and more depth. Well, it's rather flat, okay? And it's quite articulate and it's informative. Number 10, color but only with balance. That is an interesting way of showing it. Samara uses color, but you can see that on the left side there's big impact of color. And in the other 3 pictures, are a continuation of a series of pamphlets, of texts. So they use different colors here in a more restrained way. But they change the color. Pamphlet 1, pamphlet 2, pamphlet 3, they don't have the same color. Okay? The motifs are different, but there's something in the techniques that show the continuation. Okay, can we continue, please? Okay, so next, lots of color. The next one was the black and white. Of course, so less color is better was number 11. You see the top one on the left. The 12 use strong oppositions of light and darkness. They use them here, but the picture we're not close enough to it to see how the contrasts were added. No aggressive fonts. Number 13 on the top. You see how the fonts are put together differently. Maybe they're not aggressive, yet it's a way that really attracts attention. It could be dangerous looking, or he says if you don't know how to use a font, use them haphazardly. Just pick something and play with it. He doesn't have a strict recommendation. 14, use only 2 or 3 most font types. And when you look at example 14, he has different font types. He doesn't say you have to limit yourself. Okay? But it's really interesting the way he presents it. Can we continue, please? So number 15, you cannot just plank letters around images as in grafting. Well, Samara said it's not necessarily true. You can have small print and totally offset it to the sides if you need to. 16, no redundant redundancy. Samara says you can have redundancy. You can have very small color changes or different color contrasts as long as the message is conveyed in a simple and clear way. And he sees no problem with reiteration or repetition. 17, only new elements. That's what Jury says. Samara says it's much easier to rework old things, so go ahead, rework old things. Even very plain cultural popular items for interest can be reworked and made to look more modern. 18, no copy of old stuff. Samara disagrees. When there are historical connections required, you need to resort to what already exists, but you give it a new twist. 19, today's popular way of doing things is not tomorrow's. That was David Jury said. But what Samara says, because of the fast change of pace, you can use retro styling, but with a modern look. Especially with teenagers, where they're concerned, it is best to use a style that appeals to them. 20, indecision is at the core of all ambiguity. That's what Jury says. Samara says clearly it's best to be as clear as possible, yet sometimes messiness and uncertainty can also help create more complex venues for interpretation and a richer experience. Maybe I have to stop here. Yeah.
Bien, se alargó un poquito porque yo le había pedido que incluyera ejemplos para que la presentación no fuera demasiado teórica y no contábamos o no teníamos medido cómo iba a funcionar esto con la traducción, entonces esto alarga un poquito la presentación. ¿Hay más imágenes todavía para terminar de verlos?
Yeah, I find those two were also interesting, where there's a repetition with different color schemes, and then the last one, which is totally for an architectural ad or an architectural text. It's a bit disjointed. Okay. Yeah.
Bien, no sé si quieren que abramos un espacio de preguntas y respuestas. Brevemente ya nos alargamos de del tiempo que teníamos programado, pero creo que vale la pena, ¿no? Entonces, si quieren, ¿tienen algo que preguntar o algún comentario que quisieran hacer? Sí, Yarene. She wanted to return to the cacophony example, and if you could elaborate more on that example, please.
Okay. You know what cacophony means? It's when all the sound. Oh, okay. When there was a multiplicity of sounds, okay, and it's usually displeasing to the ear, right? So he recommends that you also use that for images, but you can use a cacophony in a way that it could be more pleasing. Maybe we can just go back, I think one of the images, just one back, or two back, okay.
Creo que son
one
dos.
more. Yes, that's a good example. The top one on the left, although it's a representation that's clear, but it has a cacophony of colors mixed in, okay? And so the idea is to really shock the visual system, to have people try to make sense of it. Okay? Does that help? Okay.
Jorge.
Yo quería preguntarle algo a María. Voy a tratar de hacerlo en inglés. Muy fluido,
Okay.
pero un poquito in English. What do you think about, in one hand, semiotics and on another hand, hermeneutics? We in graphic design teach separately semiotics in one time, and after this we are teaching hermeneutics. You are talking about visual cognition. I saw with your explanation that in the same time you are talking about both things, the semiotic as an structured element, and the hermeneutics as perception, as experience, etc. How do you see this?
Yes, that's exactly something I've been researching for years. And I think what I'm trying to find is how you put the two together. Okay, and actually there's a new research, and it's called GEONS. Have you heard of GEONS? G-E-O-N-S. If I had time, I would have looked on internet. You can find it on Wikipedia if you look at internet. And I think Biederman started that. And it's like an alphabet of shapes. So in fact, you don't have to go way back to semiotic studies. You can maybe just look at what he says about this alphabet of shapes and how you can combine 2 or 3 shapes. So I believe hermeneutics are most important because artists have this intuitive gift that I fully admire, because I have a little bit that I inherited from my father, but other than that, I'm more analytical. So I think if you can try to have them come together. I don't have all the answers, but I think the researchers are trying to work on this. And there is another researcher, and you'll have the references in my text, a researcher, D. Lowe, L-O-W-E, has written an unpublished thesis, a doctoral thesis at Stanford University on visual perception, and has played with combinations of elements like that. And I'll leave the references with Miguel. You might want to, actually I didn't check, it may even be online. Many times doctoral dissertations are online, unless they then got published and the author had to take copyright back. Yes. So does that help? I really believe hermeneutics, you know, what people have inside them is the most important. And then if I could quote my daughter, she has a science degree, but she's also artistic. So I said to her, she hasn't found a job with science research. So I said, why don't you go to the College of Art and Design because you're good? And she says, no, I have this gift and I want to keep my intuition. I don't want to learn the rules. So, you know, primacy is there. But I know that in your field, if you want to be commercial, whatever, and very competitive, you have to be able to come together. Now, if I could maybe use a metaphor from linguistics. When people learn a second language, there is the mother tongue, right, the first language. And then you basically build the second language starting from your knowledge of the world and of language to the second one. And then it goes like that. And in between you have interlanguage, which is like in between the two areas. And maybe before people become totally fluent in the hermeneutics and the semiotic sides, they can play in the interfaces. Yeah, I don't know. Yes.
Well, I'm gonna do it in Spanish. Do you think, bueno, hay nuevas maneras de, ¿encuentras que hay nuevas maneras en que los jóvenes ven y procesan las imágenes? Millennials. Los millennials.
How do they process images?
New
Yes,
ways to
yes.
understand and
Yes, I actually had notes on
for
that.
millennials.
So I talked about the fovea, okay? So the subject, how people process images is not by chance. There has to be an intention. It's not, it's much, well, some recent results says, first of all, in your mind, objects can be visualized in the wrong location. So it's in the brain. So it's possible that some visuals you show do not get processed properly in the brain. That's one big reason. Well, I mean, we know that. I think we suspected that. So the other question is, does the eye movement have its own independent filter? They think that the eye movement might have an independent filter. Okay. So I talked about the fovea. So nobody just looks at the same thing. We make a decision personally what we want to look at, where to concentrate. And so what they say, the area you concentrate on cognitively will be active, and we exclude the rest, basically exclude it. So you see a lot of upside down pictures, and pictures are sideways and so on. Well, according to research, you can have that. It doesn't impact at all, because all this translating or rotating or orienteering in depth, it's all perceived properly by the brain. The brain puts it where it needs to go, okay? But it requires effort, and I think that's what a lot of visual cognition research is on. Where it requires effort, people will remember it better, okay? Then there were some, yes. Then there's a question of perception being holistic or not holistic. So they have shown in research that for objects, to visualize objects, perception is both parts-based, both detail and holistic. But for words, perception of words, it is parts-based, only on the little pieces. And for faces, it's holistic. So it'd be interesting to follow the research on face recognition, because it has, from visual cognition, there's going to be new research on holistic perception. And there's also predictive power. That's interesting. The first, according to the research in cognitive science, and actually I'm glad you asked that question because I was going to add this in my conclusion. And it would be good on your part to see from your practical experience if that's how it works, if that's how you see it, and maybe do testing on subjects to get them remember how they process things. Anyway, we have this predictive power. So and the first concentration is not on the image, as I said. It's on the surface representation. And first, texture perception. Then we do visual search. And then we do motion perception. So like the first picture I showed with those supposedly moving records. Okay? This is an aspect. Whatever indicates movement, as well as what indicates texture, and the general visual area search. Those go first, before we pick an object. An example that they give in one of the, that comes from the handbooks of visual cognition, and there is one specifically by Koslin. It's the textbook, handbook number 2 on visual cognition. And they go and, you know the psychological representation of the vase versus human faces on the side? Is everybody familiar with that? Or shall I describe it a little bit more? Yeah, okay. So they actually say that if you do the vase and you don't put a contour, people do not see the two faces. So they think in visual perception, a lot is also contour driven. Okay. And then there is the study of the geons, and they studied combinations with the geons, and one was vertical position, above, below, beside, which changes your perception. For instance, I think they had a circle and a cube and a cylinder on top. And then they put the cylinder at the major thing and the circle below, and it just changed perception. Joint type, how things are joined. If you're joined end to end, or end to the middle, or end to the middle and off center. Okay, like you know how you can organize your graphics or your visuals. That is important. As well as relative size, that's important. I went to the anthropological museum yesterday, and in one of the gardens, I saw huge ants, really big ones, right? And I paid attention, right? Because, so size, when you play with size, it's important. And another aspect was relative orientation, whether things are in parallel or in an octagon or oblique and so on. And in fact, in this study, they showed 81 combinations and 15 attributes to play with. So actually, in my conclusion, I also recommended that maybe like we do in language, where we think with minimal pairs, okay? We make distinction among minimal pairs of meaning. You could use the features of Gestalt psychology, which were strong features, and maybe play with them, especially with the newer versions, you know, the updated thinking with Gestalt psychology, take some of the good features that Palmer and more modern authors have played with, and maybe play with minimal pairs and see what they can give you. There it would be hermeneutics, but you use semiotic research, right? And you could do it in a practical sense. Yeah, so, does that help? Okay.
But for example, age, does it influence the perception? Or
Age difference.
Culture?
Yes, of course. Age difference, your colleague said she worked many years at university, so have I. At Queen's this past year, I just got a diploma for 25 years at Queen's. But I worked for 10 years at Dalhousie University, so you know, I have a lot of experience. But with that comes slower eye movement. I'm not the TV generation. The students at the university where I teach, last year they told me, in the schools, when they go do their practical experience in the schools, they're lost. Well, my students are in their 5th or 6th year university, they're 22, 23, whatever. And their students already think that those young people are too slow and don't use technology fast enough, okay? So we have to deal with this. So I think for each public, you have to try to adapt. And I think the first one, be interesting to see how young, like Bounce Baby Bounce is a song by a modern, do you know this song? Anyway, somebody tried in Spain to do a cover page. And it's very interesting because I'm going to go now. So I grew up without television, without the telephone, or my age, right? But so I've gone a long way from entering those pictures, you know, scanning them and playing with them, but I've kept up with technology pretty well. So I think you have to see how people can adapt. And according to research, people who can't adapt are lost. That's a bit harsh, okay? But in your business, you have to try to adapt and please as many people as possible. So culturally also, I'm going back. In North America, if you look online, you may see YouTubes on Bounce Baby Bounce, and have women's derrieres bouncing and, you know, giving the same image compared to the very elegant Spanish representation for the same thing. So my question would be, and your question could be, what appeals more to today's generation, right? What will make them buy the record or the music, okay? And we also have difference in the color. You know that our color schemes are culturally conditioned. So, but this again, if you're working for somebody in your culture, you know what people will like. If you have to go global, I think you have to do a global study. I was involved in some research with global communication for marketing. I was at the University of Álvarez and in the business department. But I think you could use it with Carl James, who did a study internationally on what counts for certain people in the business world as being important. It's a bit far-fetched, but maybe you could draw some of those ideas into your future design endeavors. Does that help?